Hi everybody, this is lecture 2, and in this lecture we are going to focus on research questions, hypotheses, and then independent and dependent variables. Some of the things we're going to talk about today should sound pretty similar to what we already talked about during lecture 1, so it should move pretty quickly, especially with regards to research questions and hypotheses. The information about independent and dependent variables is newer. You should have gotten this in your undergraduate research class, but we are going to spend a little bit more time on that, and this is definitely a topic that's very important. And so if you have any questions that you'd like to talk through after you watch this lecture, then please let me know and we could definitely do that. Okay, so we'll start off with research questions and hypotheses. So a research question is essentially just a question that you would like to answer through your empirical research. So you would like to collect data, analyze that data, and you want to do that in an effort to answer your research question. So examples of some research questions could be, to what extent does student loan debt impact students' stress and anxiety levels? What are NKU students' perceptions of the legitimacy of NKU police officers? What is the prevalence of insomnia among NKU students? What portion of NKU students is experiencing food insecurity? What are the gender differences in GRE scores? So any of these would be acceptable research questions. When we think about narrowing down a research topic, so when you guys think about a topic that you're interested in and you're trying to figure out how do I narrow this down to a research question, there are a couple of things for you to keep in mind. And this is in general, not just as a student, but once you are working at an agency, you want to think about what are the needs of the agency where you're going to be collecting the data. For this class, you'll be collecting data on NKU's campus, not at an agency, but in the future, as a social worker, what are the needs of the agency where you're working and where you would be collecting the data. You also want to think about the feasibility of your research question and your research. You want to think about your own personal interests, so ensure that you're choosing a topic that is of interest to you. And whatever research question you're seeking to answer, it should have relevance to the social work profession. It should have relevance to, for instance, social welfare policy, social work practice, etc. So think about those 4 factors when you think about narrowing down your research topic into a research question. A good research question should be narrow and specific. So if your topic is treatment of sexually abused girls, your research question could, for instance, be, is play therapy effective in alleviating trauma symptoms among sexually abused girls aged 6 through 8? So you can see that that question is very clear, very specific, and narrow. You want to make sure that how you phrase your research question allows for it to be answered by observable evidence. So you have to be able to answer your question with data. That means that it cannot be a value-based question. So for instance, a value-based question might be, should juveniles accused of drug trafficking be tried as adults? That's value-based. A better research question would be, what are the recidivism rates for juveniles accused of drug trafficking who were tried as adults versus tried as juveniles? So there is a difference there in that you are not imposing your own value set as a researcher. Rather, you're posing a question that can be answered with observable evidence. Now, with that first question of should juveniles be accused, or should juveniles accused of drug trafficking be tried as adults, you could rephrase that and say, what is the public's attitude toward trying juveniles as adults? That, of course, is allowed because then your research question is actually inquiring about public opinion. Again, a good research question should be beneficial to social work practice and or social welfare. So it has to pass the so what test is what I call it. So if you pose a research question, I should be able to ask you, well, so what? Why is this important? And you should be able to answer that. And then obviously, if you pose a research question, there has to be more than one possible acceptable answer. You're not going to waste your time researching a truism. If you know the answer to a question, then obviously we don't want to research that again. And then your research question has to be feasible. It has to be something that you can actually answer through a research study. Instead of using a research question, you could also use a hypothesis. That generally isn't the case for student research projects, but for articles that are published in peer-reviewed journals, it's not uncommon to see hypotheses rather than research questions. So again, a hypothesis, we talked about this during our last lecture, a hypothesis is just a research question that's been transformed from a question into a statement. So that statement predicts the outcome of your study. So for instance, if your research question was, to what extent are there gender differences in GRE scores, your hypothesis could be female students score higher on GRE tests as compared to male students. So rather than framing it as a question, you are framing it as a statement where you are predicting the outcome of your study. A null hypothesis is a special type of hypothesis. With a null hypothesis, you're actually stating that there is no relationship between your variables. So if we look at that example from above again, in terms of GRE scores, the null hypothesis would be there are no gender differences in GRE scores. So again, you are with a null hypothesis, you're stating that there is no association between your variables. Okay, moving on to independent and dependent variables. This is an extremely important concept for all of you to grasp, especially because we really do need to be able to identify independent and dependent variables in research questions in order to be able to know what statistical analyses to use. So for next semester, it would be very important for you to be able to identify independent and dependent variables. Studies that are explanatory or that evaluate a program's effectiveness look at the relationship between independent and dependent variables, and also certain exploratory studies have independent and dependent variables. So an independent variable is the variable that's influencing something else. So the independent variable is the variable that has an impact on the other variable. The dependent variable is the variable that is being influenced. That dependent variable, those are the ones that the researcher is really interested in. That's the one that the researcher is really paying attention to. So the independent variable is doing the influencing. The dependent variable is the one that's being influenced. The dependent variable is dependent on the independent variable. So we're going to look at an example here. Let's say our research question is, to what extent does education have an impact on income? So again, to what extent does education have an impact on income? The first thing we have to ask ourselves is, how many variables are in this research question? And what are those variables? So the first variable that we pick up on is education. And the second variable in this research question is income. Those are the two variables that this research question is looking at. We're looking at education and we're looking at income. And then the next question we have to ask ourselves is, what is the relationship between those two variables? So which one is doing the influencing and which one is being influenced? So in this particular example, what we can see is that education, we're looking at, does education influence income? So for that reason, education is your independent variable and income is your dependent variable, because we're looking at whether income is dependent on education. So again, it's a two-step process. You have to identify the variables in your research question, and then you have to figure out what the relationship is between those variables. So which variable is influencing the other? So if we do a couple of practice questions here, let's look at the next one. So let's say the research question is, are men instinctively more aggressive than women? So here we ask again, what are our variables in this research question? Again, are men instinctively more aggressive than women? First question, how many variables are there? There are two variables in this research question: gender and aggression. Those are your two variables. Now I'll tell you a common mistake that students sometimes make is they will say that there are three variables. They'll say aggression and then men and women. Men and women, male and female, those are not two separate variables. Rather, they are attributes of one and the same variable. So your variable is gender, and that variable has two attributes, male and female. So again, to reiterate, you only have two variables in this research question, gender and aggression. The next question becomes, what is that relationship between those two? Which of these variables is being influenced and which one is doing the influencing? So in this research question, we can tell that we're looking at the impact of gender. Oh, hold on, I'll be right back. All right, guys, sorry about that. That was my dog. My kids just got home from school, so dog goes crazy. Okay, so anyway, we left off saying that this research question, are men instinctively more aggressive than women? What are the two variables? We established there's gender and then there's level of aggression. So now the next thing we have to figure out is, how does this relationship flow? So which variable is influencing the other and which one is being influenced? So in this case, when you read that research question, you can see that you're looking at, does gender have an impact on the level of aggression? So again, you're looking at gender, does that impact your level of aggression? So in that case, gender is your independent variable and level of aggression is your dependent variable, because level of aggression is being influenced potentially by gender. Okay, let's do another example. So in this research question, it reads, does cognitive behavioral therapy reduce depressive symptoms among a sample of clinically depressed women between the ages of 40 and 50? So we're going to read that again. Does cognitive behavioral therapy reduce depressive symptoms among a sample of clinically depressed women between the ages of 40 and 50? So again, the first question we have to ask ourselves is, what are the variables in this research question? So the variables in this question are cognitive behavioral therapy and depressive symptoms. This research question is pretty lengthy, and you can see here that there's this additional information about among a sample of clinically depressed women between the ages of 40 and 50. That part of this research question just tells us about our sample. This part of the question does not include specific variables. So for this research question, the only variables are CBT and depressive symptoms. The next thing we need to ask ourselves is, how do these variables relate to one another? So again, which variable is influencing the other? So again, we are looking here at, does CBT have an impact on depressive symptoms? So if we put that in here with the arrow, we're looking at CBT and its influence on depressive symptoms. So in this case, we're looking at how depressive symptoms are being influenced by cognitive behavioral therapy. And for that reason, cognitive behavioral therapy is our independent variable and depressive symptoms are our dependent variable. So we're looking at the influence of CBT on depressive symptoms. Okay, one more example here. To what extent does food insecurity impact GPA? So again, to what extent does food insecurity impact GPA? With this question, we are again asking ourselves first off, what are our two variables? What we see is that food insecurity is one of our variables and GPA is our other variable. So those are our two variables. Next question again that we ask ourselves is, which variable is influencing the other? So in this situation, we can see that it's looking at, to what extent does this impact this? To what extent does food insecurity impact GPA? So in that case, we can fill in food insecurity and how that impacts GPA. So then we know that food insecurity is our independent variable, which is potentially influencing our GPA, which is our dependent variable. Those are the only three examples that I included in this PowerPoint. However, I want you to know that this concept can be tricky, especially once you start trying it on your own. So we will talk about this more in class when we are face-to-face. But it is important for you, at this point to have a good grasp on how to identify